Good morning, good afternoon to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. As part of AGSIW's recently launched China Gulf Initiative, we are pleased to be hosting this discussion today around the Routledge Handbook on China-Middle East Relations, an essential publication that provides valuable insights into how China's growing Middle East and specifically Gulf presence affects regional development, trade, security, and diplomacy. We're truly delighted to have with us the editor and three of the contributing authors to this volume. First, I'm happy to welcome Jonathan Fulton, the editor of this publication. He is an assistant professor of political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi and a non-resident senior fellow for Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. He's an expert on Chinese policy toward the Middle East and the author of China's Relations with the Gulf Monarchies and co-editor of External Powers and the Gulf Monarchies. I'm also happy to welcome back our good friend Mohammed Al-Sudairi, senior researcher with the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies and a postdoctoral fellow at the Hong Kong Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. His research largely focuses on Chinese domestic politics and China-Middle East relations. Last but not least is Yuting Wang, a professor in the Department of International Studies at the American University of Sharjah in the UAE. She is also an affiliated research fellow at the Center on Religion and Chinese Society at Purdue University. Her research areas are Muslim minorities in North America and China, Chinese diaspora, China-UAE relations, and public health policy in the UAE. Moderating the session today is AGSIW Senior Resident Scholar Robert Mogielnicki, who leads our China Gulf Initiative and is also one of the contributors to this publication. He's a specialist in the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa and teaches a graduate level seminar on China-Middle East relations or China-Middle East and North Africa relations at Georgetown University's Law School of Foreign Service. And with that, Robert, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with this great lineup of panelists. And I think before we begin formally here, I think we all know this conversation's taking place amid a very challenging geopolitical period. So appreciate everyone joining us today, the panelists and the audience, and hope that everyone's families are doing as well as possible. So in addition to giving us all a chance to step away from some of the news headlines, as Raymond said, we're really pleased to kick off this first program in our new China Gulf Initiative here at AGSIW. And it won't be a surprise to anyone in this panel or in the audience to say that Gulf-China relations reflect a fast-growing and also multifaceted sphere, generating substantial interest from governments, from business people, and other observers. With that in mind, the Gulf is no stranger to persistent tensions and competitive dynamics associated with the growing US-China rivalry. External observers want to know what exactly is the nature of Chinese involvement in the Gulf, how has it manifested, where is it heading, and what are the implications? Assessments of Sino-Gulf relations are also playing out on a domestic level. We have local governments and other actors hoping to get the most out of their partnerships with Chinese counterparts while also avoiding some of the pitfalls associated with these ties. Now, what you'll find in this book and what we've tried to recreate with the composition of today's expert panel is a broad and working overview of ties. And I'll stress this is really part of a longer and ongoing conversation about China Gulf and China Middle East relations. The book, by the way, as Raymond noted, includes coverage of other Middle Eastern and North African case studies. And before I forget, I think it's only appropriate to congratulate Jonathan for pulling this all together as the sole editor. I mean, other contributors like the rest of us on the screen, we deserve a tiny sliver of credit. But they say that edited volumes can be a nightmare to organize. I think Jonathan pulled this excellent publication together in record time and also, at the utmost level of professionalism. So I can say that had this book been available while I was putting together the syllabus for the course I taught last fall, it would have made my life immensely easier. I know this will be incredibly useful for other professors going forward, but it's definitely a worthwhile investment for various members of our government, business, and media communities too. So with that out of the way, I think we'll kind of get into the meat of the conversation today. Now, I come at this broad topic primarily from a political economy background. But today we're going to explore Sino-Gulf relations from a number of different angles: foreign policy, energy dependence, soft power, people-to-people ties. And we have a lot of potential topics to cover as well, from the BRI to free trade agreements to tourism and even vaccine diplomacy. I expect plenty of questions from the audience, so please send those through, and I'll try to weave them into the conversation. And due to the disciplinary backgrounds of our panelists, which is rather diverse, I would encourage you to direct your questions to a particular panelist, or at least flag who you would hope to have this question answered by, and I will do my best to send it their way. I'm going to take some time to ask a few questions on my own as moderator, and the first question is actually going to go over to Jonathan. So, Jonathan, you clearly thought that China, Middle East, and North Africa relations was a story worth telling in a book. And we know that many Chinese actors view the Gulf as a stable, wealthy subsystem of the broader Middle East. But why in particular should we be paying close attention to Sino-Gulf relations at this moment? So over to you.
Thanks, Robert. And thanks to the folks at the Institute. I'm glad to have this chance to talk to your audience about the book. And you put together a great panel. And thanks for the kind words about the book. I mean, you're right. Editing a book like this maybe was a little foolish because it was, 26 chapters. It was a lot of work, but really it was just such an amazing team. I mean, everybody, the three of you, but really it couldn't have been an easier process. It was really a labor of great joy. Actually, I had a great time doing it. So as to your question of why we should be thinking about China and the Gulf, I mean, I live in Abu Dhabi, so I'm looking at it from this vantage point. And typically as a political scientist, teaching IR, international relations, I keep telling my students, look at these issues from a level of analysis perspective, from the domestic, the regional, the systemic. And when you look at China's engagement in the Gulf across those three realms, you see a lot of really interesting dynamics that have a pretty significant impact and can really shape the way things change here in the region. Domestically, I mean, if you look at Gulf countries, domestic political economies, you see, of course, everybody is looking at development issues, looking at economic issues. How can these countries achieve their development goals, their vision programs, or whatever? This is something that requires a lot of engagement with foreign countries and foreign companies. And China, of course, it just so happens that it's launched this Belt and Road Initiative shortly before these vision programs were articulated. And as a result, you see a lot of synergy between what the BRI's ambitions are and what Gulf countries are trying to accomplish. So, I think a lot of what we saw, especially in the early days of the Belt and Road, where it was a lot of hard infrastructure projects, it's kind of moved away from that. What you see, especially in terms of tech, which you wrote so well about in the book, what China's doing in helping with smart cities and 5G networks and fintech and all these different areas, AI, different aspects of technological development. China's been making pretty big inroads with a lot of GCC countries. So in terms of the developmental aspect, it's helping these countries develop a lot of issues that they really want to address. Economic, of course, China's the biggest trading partner, the biggest extra-regional trading partner in the region. It's not even close. You'll see countries like India with specific countries that the trading relationship with the UAE, for example, might be, a number one, number two situation, but really China's economic relations across the region are pretty substantial, and that gives it an extra weight. And then, of course, you see, again, I think John Alterman had an interesting article maybe a week or two ago about how everybody's hedging. And this is another issue which kind of relates to a lot of bigger issues that a lot of Gulf countries realize that given the situation they find themselves in, great power relationships are quite important. And in this, it's not just China. I mentioned India. India is a tremendously important country, as we know, just because of the free trade agreement that they just signed with the UAE. You can look at the EU, Japan, Korea, any number, UK, any number of extra-regional countries. It's not just about China or the US, but China is a very significant one of those partners. So at the domestic level, I think there's a lot that's happening. At the regional level, of course, the fact that China has very dense relations with Iran also is a factor. And it's something I think that often gets missed because you see, especially, and this isn't to slag my friends in DC, but there's a lot of politicized analysis that says, oh, China and Iran, these revisionist countries are going to disrupt the Middle East and take over the world. And what this misses is that, yes, China and Iran have a comprehensive strategic partnership. So does China with Saudi, and so does China with the UAE. It has maintained a pretty balanced approach to the region. And unlike a lot of traditional extra-regional powers, China has the capacity to deal with both sides of the Gulf at once in a way that you don't see. So I think the fact that China is deeply engaged with Iran, with Saudi, with the UAE, has a pretty important regional dynamic. And then if you go on to the bigger systemic or broader international dynamic, and you look at, this great power competition or strategic competition narrative of, this superpower narcissism where Washington, Beijing, and Moscow seem to relegate the rest of us to secondary or third-tier actors. But certainly that's something that folks in the Gulf are looking at very, very closely, because you can see, for example, Presidential Advisor Anwar Gargash has made multiple public statements in recent months about how this is a concern for the Emirates. How do you navigate this tension at the international level? It does have a big impact on the options that are available to Gulf countries, and it's just something that we're just going to have to deal with. Is how this changing this changing international order affects the Gulf and how the China-U.S. relationship impacts that. So there's a lot to talk about, but I'd rather hear from Mohammed and Yuting because their work in the book was fantastic too. So I'll stop here and wait for your questions later.
Great, thank you, Jonathan, for those opening remarks. And I mean, one of the points you mentioned about the comprehensive economic partnership between the UAE and India that includes, free trade agreement characteristics. And they were able to push ahead with that, but the FTA between the GCC and China is still, very much a work in progress. Something that's been in the works, so to speak, since 2004. So I imagine that's something that some of our audience members might like to hear a little bit more about, but certainly was something that jumped up on the radar in your talk there. So let's move over to Yuting, and I'd like to hear a little bit more. Moving away from economic and political analyses as such that sometimes paint a very transactional picture of relations. I mean, what can some of the social and cultural exchanges or examples of these exchanges teach us about the foundations of Sino-Gulf ties and also some of the longer term implications where these ties may be heading?
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for having me here today. And then first, just let me say that and I'm really thankful for this opportunity to contribute to this edited volume. And it actually confirmed my initial hunch that there's something that worth exploring about this long-term relationship that China is building with the Gulf region through these people-to-people interactions. And then this is one of the aspects that is actually inadequately examined and given the broad picture that we're all interested in. And so when I came to the UAE in 2009, we already know that China is developing a presence here in the region. And it was very interesting to observe what is evolving actually on the ground. And for me, as a sociologist who's trained actually in sociology of religion, and also I've been studying immigrants, religious minorities, and then this has been actually a fantastic experience to look at some of these phenomena close up. And so now in terms of this social and cultural exchanges, I think, for all the observers of China-Gulf relations in the last decade, I think, we probably all noticed that the relationship between China and the Gulf has become much more multifaceted than before. And in addition to these economic ties and that China's built through trade and commerce, and inevitably we've seen a flow of people into the region, and they come from such diverse backgrounds and they brought interesting ideas to the region. And they also represent this new generation of Chinese migrants who are vastly different from the previous generations. So we're looking at young entrepreneurs, very well-educated younger generation who came of age in the 21st century. And so we're actually looking at this very much, entrepreneurial, spirited young generation of Chinese people who are looking into the possibility of developing or identifying a niche in the region. So some of these phenomena are still growing and maybe at a very initial stage, but I think they will have long-term implications. I have a limited time here, but I just wanted to point out a couple of interesting developments that I've observed in recent years. And then, of course, the Chinese school. I think that is a very important signal to show that there is a long-term presence of Chinese community now in the GCC. Since I came to the UAE in 2009, one of the biggest questions and people ask is whether China is going to open a school, whether there's going to be a Chinese school. It started as a commercial project, but it ended up to be the first nonprofit school commissioned by the Ministry of Education of China, which adopts the Chinese national curriculum. And this is the first one that ever established outside China. And choosing UAE, choosing Dubai as the location for this project, I think it really has a long-term implication. It's going to attract more Chinese to settle down in the region and then to also develop a long-term plan in the region. So their existence is no longer that transactional. It's probably, we're looking at something, down the road, maybe a couple of generations down the road. So they have the plan here to invest in here, and then they also become more engaged with the local community. I think that's another phenomenon I wanted to talk about. I actually wrote about that in the chapter I contributed to the edited volume. I think this institutional completeness has been really important to support the growth of diasporic communities. And we have studied overseas Chinese in many different locations, but not enough here, I would say, in the GCC. But this developments have been really quite impressive, I would say, in the last few years, and especially during COVID. The Chinese community has been quite active in many different ways. So their interest is no longer in making profits, right? Making a fortune, and they really do want to engage. And now being in the UAE, and it provides this cosmopolitan environment for these young people to really seek out a different way to project the image of China. That's something that I think would interest many more researchers and in the future. And I really hope that we'll have more people who are interested in exploring this social, cultural exchanges between China and the UAE in the coming decades. I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to take questions later on.
Well, I would maybe say it's more of a pause, because I expect we'll be getting back to you very quickly. I mean, you mentioned in these opening remarks a number of different segments of the population in the region of Chinese residents, whether they be entrepreneurs, students, and then also you mentioned tourism. I mean, these segments of different groups of people are important, represent important markets, and also are key parts of the development strategies of many Gulf Arab states. So we'll definitely be touching on those topics a bit more as the conversation evolves. Let's shift over now to Mohammed, joining us from Beijing. Your chapter looked specifically at China-Oman relations, and this is, for me, a fascinating bilateral relationship to look at. And I know there are a number of people here in Washington, Europe, and otherwise who are equally interested in this particular bilateral relationship. I wonder if you could give us a view about to your mind, what are the key areas of China's ties with Oman, and where do some of these linkages converge and diverge with those of other GCC states? I mean, what's unique about this relationship, and what is something that we can say may impact, many of the other Gulf Arab neighbors?
Thank you so much for your question, Robert. I should say, first of all, that I'm speaking from the Beijing time zone, not from Beijing. I would love to go back to Beijing, but they have shut the borders quite tight. I'm speaking from Hong Kong. And also I'd like to thank the friends at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. It's very good to be back. And also I wanted to thank Jonathan for bearing with me with my constant pestering over corrections in the editorial process. But he made it very smooth, and it was a wonderful experience overall. Now, turning to your question, I should say that at the macro or broader level, the Omani-China relationship shares in sort of the same trends and dynamics as we see with the rest of the GCC. And in fact, it also has to contend with the question of the glass ceiling challenge that will creep up in the next decade or so. And I can talk about that maybe at a later stage. I discussed it also in other writings that I've had in the past prior to this particular chapter. But looking sort of at the micro level, in comparison to other GCC states, Oman shows elements or aspects of exceptionalism. And we can think of this, or we can see this exceptionalism come to the fore in 4 particular dimensions. The first is really the historical cultural dimension, in the sense that the coasts of Oman have had sustained interactions that have ebbed and flowed with the region that we today identify as the People's Republic of China, going back for more than a millennia. And there's significant textual and material evidence from the Song, Yuan periods, in the case of China, from the Abbasid era onwards, of these forms of interaction. And certainly we have references of different Omani figures, at least people who come from Sahar or Qalhat or other places, who have settled in the Chinese entrepots, whether it's Yangzhou or Guangzhou, and have been involved in sort of the saga of the diasporas there. And of course, these types of interactions have continued on and sustained themselves, and it's partially due to Oman's entanglements with the Indian Ocean, right? That makes it also unique when compared to other parts of the GCC. But what is important with these types of historical legacies is that it offers officials on both sides of the Asiatic landmass a very rich historical legacy to draw upon when framing and discussing the relationship that is not really as salient when we look at other GCC countries. In the sense that for other GCC states, when they talk about sort of the historical dimensions, they refer to these broad narratives, right? The Zhenghe expedition in the early 15th century, sort of this idea of an Arab presence in coastal China. But in the case of Oman, we have a much more direct legacy that allows them to very creatively frame this relationship. So for instance, in Sultan Qaboos's early engagement with China in 1981, he had commissioned the rebuilding of a traditional Arab dhow that undertook a voyage from Oman all the way to the port city of Guangzhou to demonstrate the capacity of such ships to conduct long-term trade. And this was celebrated in sort of, the official media, and it's still commemorated, and monuments have also been erected in commemoration of this particular visit. And I can give many, many other references, whether, the refurbishment of the Maritime Museum in Quanzhou, the city that's been traditionally called Zaytun, dedications of a mosque associated with the Qingjing Mosque, also in Quanzhou, which is one of the few instances really of Abbasid-style architecture in East Asia, dating back to the early 11th century. So there's a lot in which the Omanis and sort of their Chinese counterparts can draw upon that makes it very unique when compared to to other actors in the GCC. Of course, that doesn't mean all of this history can be invoked and referenced, because parts of the history is also intentionally silenced, particularly if we think about sort of the Dhafari revolutions, utilization of Maoist slogans, symbols, and even modes of political and ideological organization in the late 1960s. But still, there is a rich repertoire to draw upon. The 3 other dimensions include the political, in the sense that while Oman does not have as deep and as verbose of an official language in terms of how they depict the political relationship as the UAE and Saudi enjoy with China, in the sense that all of these are comprehensive strategic relationships. There are coordinating committees. This is all absent in the case of Oman. There is actually a lot of comity and concordance in the context of the relationship. And what I have seen in my conversations with Chinese officials and scholars, and in even looking in sort of the academic work that comes out from China, is that Oman tends to be imagined a lot more positively than other GCC actors, primarily because of its emphasis on neutrality, its positioning in terms of intra-GCC conflict, its relationship with Oman, which is really interesting to consider, given that, formally, a strategic relationship was only used to describe the relationship quite late. And up to this moment, we have not had a president or a premier visit Oman since 1989, with Yang Shangkun's visit. Certainly the highest political leader to have visited Oman recently was Wang, who is the head of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Committee, but also one of the key heads in the Politburo, but not yet any Chinese president so far. And some people attribute this to issues of protocol, that Sultan Qaboos had been invited repeatedly to come to Beijing, but this has never taken place. But the key point or takeaway is that politically, there seems to be a deeper reciprocal respect on both sides, and not apprehensions that are necessarily hidden behind very polite political language or diplomatic language. I'm not sure how we're doing time-wise, but maybe I'll try to be brief with the two other points.
Please, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The third point is in the case of security, in the sense that Oman is, in comparison to other parts of the GCC, one of the few places that has had sustained security cooperation with China, primarily in terms of offering docking rights and logistical services to the People's Liberation Army's Navy's presence, which is, of course, there as a result of the anti-piracy task force that is operating in the Gulf of Aden. And this relationship has continued on up to this moment. But what's particularly interesting when you think about this is that these types of security interactions are not as politicized or as sensitive when compared to those that the UAE or Saudi Arabia are attempting to do with China, and not even necessarily in the military domain. If we think about, say, key technologies such as power generation, there are a lot of red flags that are raised with regards to those actors than is the case with Oman. And this has a lot to do, I think, with, again, Omani neutrality, but also its emphasis on multilateralism and engaging with multiple parties. The very fact that it offers docking services and has different types of cooperative agreements with India, the United Kingdom, its longstanding benefactor, and the United States, creates less stress and issue. And in that respect, it could be considered even similar to Djibouti in sort of a distance, taking it as a distant comparison. So that's also one aspect that makes Oman in some ways distinct from the rest of the GCC. And the last point is really in the economic domain, in the sense that Oman is, of course, a rentier economy, very much like the rest of the GCC, but it's also one of those spaces where its energy relationship with China is somewhat similar in some ways to Sudan and later South Sudan's energy relationship with China, in the sense that at this moment, around 80% or so, give or take, in the last few years of total Omani exported hydrocarbons, which is around 900,000 barrels per day, goes to the Chinese market alone. But of course, in terms of what percentage does Oman constitute in terms of Chinese imports, it's a very small slither. So there's actually quite a significant asymmetry that creates a very dependent relationship that does not exist in the case of other GCC states. And that, of course, has implications in terms of the structure of the economic relationship that gives Oman, in some ways, a uniqueness in the context of the Gulf but a normality when compared to other African or Asian developing states and their own economic relationship with China. And also certainly that shapes, for example, what types of cooperation is backed by the Omani state vis-a-vis China. Their emphasis, for example, on industrial development and the training of technical know-how that is more similar to what you'd expect in the African context than in the GCC one. I'll stop there, but I think these sort of 4 points highlight very briefly some of the key distinguishing points about Oman. And so the case study is very interesting in sort of teasing these out, but also thinking in a more broader term, what are the structural problems that Oman is facing that, make it comparable to the rest of the GCC? Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. You're right. I mean, this is a very interesting case study, and we will get back to you to elaborate a bit more on some of the ceilings that you mentioned. I mean, the glass ceiling on relations. I mean, 3 additional points kind of jumped out at me while you were talking. I mean, in terms of the resilience of this relationship, if you go back in history and you look at some of those connections, the Chinese connections to the Dhofar rebellion, those were very quickly papered over by some of the growing economic ties. And in just a few short years, Oman was exporting oil to China. So, I mean, this gives an idea, despite, what potentially could have been a very, big obstacle in enhancing relations, as was in many ways, I think, subsumed by the growing economic potential of ties. That's the first point. The second point, too, that is a curious one to think about with Oman is the transition we recently saw from Sultan Qaboos to now Sultan Haytham bin Tariq. It's a little difficult, and maybe some of you can pick up on this a bit more, but it's difficult to know now what happened in the inner circle. But from my understanding, Sultan Qaboos was, saw the potential in the relations, but was not willing to essentially completely tie his entire boat, so to speak, to the Chinese, to China. That there was some hesitancy there that played out over the last few years of Qaboos's reign. And I think now with the new sultan in town, there's a potential to reset some of those aspects of relations that maybe have not moved as quickly as some would have liked. Certainly some of Qaboos's advisors were very intent on developing relations with China. But that, and then brings us to the energy component, which is, you're speaking my language there at the end, the economic ties. And you mentioned just how much of Omani oil is actually shipped to China. And in 2020, there were some months where that figure reached 90 or 100% of foreign exports. So I think you're right to pick up on that as a key area of economic ties. And maybe that's a good point to go back to Jonathan on the energy angle. I mean, we hear a lot about energy security when we talk about China's relations with the Middle East, and in particular Gulf countries. But I mean, what do you think about this? I mean, how does this fit into your view of China-Gulf ties? And are there other angles that we may miss if we focus too much on energy ties?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there was a point, I guess, an early period when people were thinking about China and the Gulf, and energy really dominated the narrative. And then in recent years, it's been kind of the China-Iran, how does this affect the strategic landscape? But I think, both cases, it misses what both Yuting and Mohammed have really fleshed out, that there's a lot more happening. It's not just one thing. In terms of the energy relationship, and I'm looking at the really great guest list you have right now. There's a lot of people who know a lot more about energy economics than me. But you can look at, in 2016, China released this Arab policy paper. And it was the first time they'd rolled out any kind of white paper for the region. And one of the things that didn't really get talked about a whole lot at the time was this initiative called the 1+2+3 strategic or cooperation framework. And it really laid out how China wanted to engage with Arab countries in the region. Each of these numbers represented a different part of a different sector that they were going to work on. And one, of course, said energy at the core. traditional hydrocarbons. China imports a lot of oil and gas from the Gulf and other actors in the Middle East, and it's a very important part of the economic relationship. But the other two, the 2 and the 3 part, also really kind of flesh out why it's more sustainable. Because if it's just a matter of China getting oil and gas from the region, we can get that from any number of different places, right? So that puts a ceiling on the relationship. And I think everybody realizes that. So what China did with the 2 is it looked at, construction and infrastructure, trade and investment. And 3 is where your specialization kind of fits in, where it looks at things like renewable energies, nuclear energy, and tech. So when you look at this, China has articulated a very sustainable long-term approach to the region that's more than just about getting energy. And I think one thing that's interesting about this is when they talk about these initiatives, these focal points, things like strategic objectives don't really fit into it. It's mostly economics driven or developmental driven. So I think, again, it's looking at the region as how can you engage with these countries without disrupting a pretty unstable regional order, especially knowing that the bigger picture, of course, is the China-US relationship, and where the US has this preponderant power in the region. How can you engage with these countries without alienating Washington and without stressing the relationships between America's allies and partners in the region? So it looks like a pretty careful approach to the region, I would argue. It looks like a pretty, again, sustainable one. And it's one that's not just based on energy. There's a lot of different moving parts. And I think if you look towards what's going to be happening in the future, especially in the tech sectors, especially in the renewable energy sectors, I mean, this really seems to me the trajectory that we should be looking at for the future.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, you've done a really good job in your work, or it's been helpful for me anyway, in how you have continually used that 1 + 2 + 3 cooperation pattern as a way to explain different dynamics. And looking at it from an economic perspective, that pattern has actually been more useful for me to understand Chinese economic interest in the region than the BRI, for example, which gets pretty fuzzy pretty quickly. I think it's a good way to kind of open up a conversation, but not necessarily the most useful always when you kind of start digging a little bit deeper. But let me now move over to Yuting and talk a little bit more as we move from this. If we take that cooperation pattern, maybe as a good segue, moving from the core of energy to things like, in the higher tech realms, cutting edge technologies, different applications, you do start to move in a direction that in many ways starts to get toward soft power manifestations in the Gulf. I mean, I think there's a close linkage there, and we need more time to completely flesh this out. But I did want to hear from you, given your background and your expertise, about what some of the ways, what to your mind are some of the ways in which Chinese soft power is really manifesting in the Gulf. You mentioned the establishment of schools and laying a foundation for a longer term, residency and engagement in the region. Beyond the academic foundation, what are some other indicators of increasing Chinese soft power in the region?
Thank you, Robert, for the question. And then about soft power, I think, there has been a lot of discussions about, how well China can do in improving soft power, because China has been seen as actually having limited success in projecting its soft power in the region, not just in the region, in the global in general. But China or Chinese government actually has been doing quite a lot to improve its soft power. But now on the ground, of course, we know Confucius Institute has been this very, traditional sort of, driving force of China's soft power projects, with very limited and very controversial outcomes. But now in the UAE, obviously, the Confucius Institute continue to play a very important role in bridging the gap between China and the GCC residents, and through providing language education. So that's still there. And there are 2 Confucius Institutes, in fact, in the country, and it's actually quite unique. Then we have a lot of these, individuals. I think, and again, that comes to my area of specialization. I've actually been looking at, how the concept of citizen diplomacy is start to develop. And we know that this is a concept that is mostly about how, in the United States, citizens, whether they're students or teachers or athletes, artists, and so on and so forth, and can help to shape US foreign policies or foreign relations with other countries. But it's very weak in China. And we know that in the Chinese educational system, civic engagement or civic participation has not been really emphasized. And so, when the Chinese move outside China and settle down in overseas, and they wanted to engage, but they don't really have the kind of capacity to engage, and they're not really equipped with that kind of ability or capital, whether that's cultural capital, social capital, to engage. But I think this is changing with this younger generation coming of age and who have had probably global education and language skills developed, and also greater ability to engage with the civil society as they live abroad. So in the UAE, if we look at soft power projects, and then we can see some of those are state sponsored. So we have the state media running here in the UAE. People's Daily publishes in newspapers here, and then it's distributed widely, but of course, mostly to the Chinese audience and readers. But then we have social media. TikTok is pretty popular here in the region, and so that is one major platform for people to get to see this new image of China. But of course, in terms of the content, right, in terms of the content production and then development, and then of course there's a lot to talk about. But we see this new generation that I mentioned earlier, the younger generation, who have identified their niche in the UAE, and I've just been talking to Jonathan a couple of weeks ago about these new social media startups, bloggers, who have actually been able to gather very large number of followers, actually, both inside China and outside China, and they wanted to understand the GCC, understand the society, and then probably also very interested in our society in general, and Islamic culture in general. And so these platforms actually can become very important means to improve China's influence, and so to speak, the soft power. Then another thing that I wanted to mention has to do with the consequence probably of COVID. We know that since COVID started, and the collaborations between China and the GCC and the Middle East in general has actually increased. So we have this Silk Road, or the Health Silk Road, being revived. And we know that started already before COVID, but during COVID time, it really strengthened the tie between China and then GCC through these collaborative projects, such as development of vaccination in the UAE. I myself actually was a volunteer of the third wave trial of Sinopharm vaccination here in the UAE. And so that's, evidence actually to show that China is developing its influence in a different ways. And some of those manifestations, I probably, would be difficult to define as soft power, but we might call that smart power. Chinese educational model can be quite attractive here to some of these parents who are looking at alternatives. And so we've seen these developments, but I saw actually there's a question for me from Wang, if I can just mention that, because I think this has a lot to do with the question you asked me. Yes, there's an outflow of people from the UAE and in GCC in general during the COVID. And we know because the problems with business, and then they had to leave. And we're also seeing actually the close down of the Chinese tourist market completely in the last 2 years. So yes, this is probably a low point in terms of people-to-people interactions, but we do see this solid group of Chinese expats who continue to live here and to really sort of develop their interactions with various expat groups and during the COVID, and trying really hard actually and to on a project, a long-term goal here, raising their children and participate in philanthropy and so on. So that's. But then during this time, I would say, the population or the demographic of Chinese expats are also probably become quite complicated with the inflow of a large Chinese population actually from Southeast Asia. And of course, those are the dark side of globalization. We're seeing that happening here in the UAE. So yes, I think the Chinese presence has actually become so diversified. And so there are many different ways that China can improve its soft power, whether it's through establishing educational institutions, through the developing of these grassroots organizations that basically, supported by this provincial friendship associations, which are very common in overseas Chinese diasporic communities, or through state-sponsored programs such as Confucius Institutes or healthcare sector exchanges, healthcare sectors, and so. But then yes, China still have a long way to go, I think, to really improve its soft power. A lot of these projects are not really materializing, I would say, and there has to be some sort of a smart investment and smart developments, and to continue sort of boost the China's image in the region. It will take many generations probably, and to reach that level. But then we can see that the development is toward that direction with more people-to-people interactions and the younger generation, and bringing in or injecting new energies to these projects.
So smarter investments in a longer term time frame. I think we'll have to wait on that. But the point you mentioned about tourism is also another really curious point to watch. I think we'll be keeping a close eye on this, on the zero COVID policies in China, which, if they continue to persist, are certainly going to continue to have a negative impact on the supply of Chinese tourists who will be able to kind of visit the Gulf and take part in many of these growing tourism sectors, some of the more established ones in the UAE, but of course, growing ones in places like Saudi Arabia. So that's certainly going to be an area to watch. I think probably represents one of the shorter term glass ceilings that Mohammed brought up in his last comments. And maybe I'll shift back to you and let you expand a little bit more on what some of those glass ceilings are, in your view, in the China-Oman relationship, but also maybe what are some of the areas that aren't necessarily going to be constrained by glass ceilings that you see actually having the potential to accelerate quite substantially over the next coming years?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. But maybe before I answer that, I'd like to sort of maybe build on Jonathan and Yuting's comments, because, when I was listening to them in terms of, for example, the ways in which China's positioning in the region is depicted, particularly in the Beltway, or thinking about the problem of China faces in terms of soft power, I think it might be very useful to have sort of a historically minded reading of these challenges and these stories, because we've heard them before in the context of the 20th century. So for instance, off the top of my head, if we look at the People's Republic's doppelganger, the Republic of China, in the 1960s and 1970s, it had a relationship with Saudi Arabia in the economic and security and political realms that could only but be called a very intimate alliance. I mean, you had Taiwanese pilots wearing Saudi military fatigues, piloting F-5s procured from America to bombard southern Yemen throughout the 1980s. And this was an operation that was called the Mogielnicki, right? The Great Desert Operation, or the Great Desert Plan. There are certainly a lot of the infrastructural projects that we see in which China is playing a massive role. the Republic of China played a very similar role in the 1970s and 1980s. A lot of the major Saudi highways, if they were not undertaken by Korean contracted firms, were undertaken by Taiwanese ones. So there are a lot of echoes with the past. And what is interesting is that while Saudi was the last state to cut ties with Taipei, that intimate alliance, once it's lost its geostrategic imperatives, just was simply sidelined. And I think this is the case with China in the sense that oftentimes people read China's interactions in the Gulf in particular ways and assume that there is an endpoint that will ultimately lead to Chinese hegemony, or it's assuming a role similar to that of the US. So the historical mindedness is necessary, even in terms of sort of the soft power predicaments. A lot of the instruments and tools that are used today are very much similar to Chinese external propaganda in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, the language of Arabic language publications, the ways in which government tours were organized. There's actually a very great work that's been done by a scholar by the name of Kyle von de Haddad, who sort of compared the approaches that China had done vis-a-vis the Middle East in terms of external propaganda in the 1950s with the current moment, comparing itineraries and different approaches. So a historical mindedness might be necessary in terms of how we read about China's, or sort of the larger Chinese world's footprint in the Middle East, and that there are many echoes of, from the past that should inform how we think about the current moment and where it could potentially go. Now, with regards to the question on the glass ceilings, I think the main problem, as I see it, is really in the political economy of China-GCC relations, in the sense that on both sides, there are a lot of changes that are being implemented by political elites that are in response to the unsustainability of their current economic models. In China, for the last few years, we've seen an emphasis on supply side sort of reform. We've seen, a new language being used, which is the new normal in terms of particular expectations about the state and its role and certain how the economy is run. But also in the Gulf, there is a recognition that its rentierist model is no longer sustainable. Reserves are declining generally. You have rising populations with considerable demand, consumerist demands on that energy resource, but also on the state. And you can also see, as part of this larger story, that the need or the dependency on Gulf oil is also declining as a result of larger technological shifts, changes in consumer patterns. And this is a process that will unfold over the next 10 to 20 years. Certainly Oman, perhaps in the case of the Gulf, and likewise Bahrain, face the most extreme predicaments in the sense that their oil reserves are expected to be exhausted within the scope of 15 years or so. And so that has implications for the nature of the economic relationship in the sense that it will probably experience contraction and downsizing, and will also change in terms of its nature and makeup. And that is the primary sort of glass ceiling that we need to take into consideration when we think about the relationship. Politically, I think the relationship will continue to be very cordial and very workable in the sense that, sort of the political expectations on both sides are quite stable. And I don't think for a moment that in Beijing or in Abu Dhabi or Riyadh, that there are any illusions of moving towards a security compact similar to the ones that people perceive to exist between the US and the GCC states. Of course, everything is up in the open, and certainly new processes and new debates might take hold among elites that would change their approach to these questions, but I don't really see it. But the main glass ceiling is really in the economic realm, and that certainly will have impact on how we read other domains, right? And certainly other areas, particularly technology, as Yuting had mentioned and Jonathan had mentioned, will gain salience, but in the context of relationships that will become increasingly more normal from an economic angle. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed. I'd like to give Jonathan and Yuting a chance as well to pick up, perhaps moving away from Oman to some of the other countries in the Gulf. Maybe Jonathan would like to look at some of the others outside of Oman and the UAE. Yuting has done a lot of work in the UAE, but where you see some of these priority areas for accelerating Chinese influence and presence in these countries, and where are some of the areas that you expect might be decelerating, or there are a number of constraints that might limit the potential of those ties? And I'm asking you the tricky question to forecast a bit, but I suspect many people in our audience would be very curious to hear your thoughts here. So maybe we'll start with Jonathan.
Yeah, asking a political scientist to forecast the future is always a great idea, Robert, because we're so good at it. But you know, if I'm looking at where I'd expect to see an intensification of Chinese presence in the Gulf, well, I mean, the obvious one would be Qatar, because you know they were on a pretty good trajectory up until 2017. You'd mentioned earlier the stalled or the slow pace of the China GCC free trade agreement, and compared with the UAE India one. Well, you know, it's a case of bilateral agreement versus a multilateral. When you're dealing with a multilateral organization that just hasn't worked, hasn't functioned for a couple of years now, right? So it certainly made it difficult. But if you look at what China and Qatar were doing together up until about 2017, I mean, they elevated the bilateral relationship to a strategic partnership, I believe in 2015. That year alone, I think there was something like $8 billion worth of construction and contracting deals signed. They opened a currency swap agreement with a Chinese bank in Qatar. I mean, it really seemed like there was there wasn't much of a ceiling that bilateral relationship was going to take off. And then 2017 happened, you know, and for Beijing, this was an issue because the year before, Xi Jinping had said, I want to see this free trade agreement done by 2017. You know, there've been a round of talks. I think there've been 4 rounds of talks throughout 2016. They're really making some headway. And then this rift happened. And you could see, you know, Chinese diplomats said all the right things. You know, we want to see this resolved by the countries involved. We're happy to be mediators if need be, but this is an issue for them to sort out. Of course, there's that old, you know, concept of non-interference and others' domestic affairs. But if you look at what happened, Beijing totally sided with the other side. You know, with the UAE, we saw, you know, Xi Jinping came to Abu Dhabi, a year later, and elevated the UAE strategic partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership that put the UAE at the top tier of China's diplomatic relations. And we've seen nothing but smooth sailing since then in the bilateral relationship. Whereas with Qatar, I mean, the Qatari Emir went to Beijing in January 2020 or 2019. I can't remember, COVID, but a few months afterwards. And you know that the expectation was that Qatar also would be elevated to that same level. And Beijing just kind of quietly said, we're happy with you where you are. You know, this is a good position. And so you could see they were kind of tipping the scales in this case. This is speculation, of course, on my part, but it does seem to bear out just looking at the trajectory of the different relationships over the past few years. But after Al-Ula last January, you know, Yang Jiechi visited, Wang has visited Doha. There's been a lot of talk of intensifying that relationship, getting back on track. So I would expect to see that Qatar is going to start to see some pretty significant gains in the relationship with Beijing. I haven't really seen much in terms of what they've done since then, but certainly the diplomatic momentum is there, and it seems to make sense. I would say that the issue from China's perspective is a lot of what they're trying to achieve. You know, when you look at the Belt and Road or different regional strategies or initiatives, it's about connectivity. You know, it's about building business clusters, it's about connecting markets, about connecting societies. And that's, again, why I think the China-Iran relationship, it gets exaggerated, because Iran has been fundamentally isolated politically, strategically, you know, across any number of realms. And Qatar found itself in that same situation where it didn't connect to a whole lot, so it became less valuable in the strategic calculus of what China was trying to do in the region. Whereas the UAE, for example, is hyper-connected. right? With this great logistics hub, with its great airlines, with just its, Jebel Ali and what, how it trades throughout the region and multiple regions. So, when I look at what China's doing in the region, I always have an eye to that logic, which countries fit more easily into these broader strategic objectives. I think Qatar has the potential to increase its engagement there. Saudi, of course, is always important. But I think, again, not to get too much into the geopolitics of it, but I think the relationship between Saudi and the US rather, puts some complications in there that doesn't necessarily exist with other countries at the same level. But I'm probably getting out of my depth on that one. Mohammed could probably talk about the Saudi-China relationship better than me. But I think if, just to answer your question, which countries do you expect to see a deeper engagement? I'd say Qatar. I think the UAE is going to continue for reasons that have already been discussed. I think Oman has a lot of fundamental problems, not just from the economic side, because again, China is fundamentally interested in economic engagement in the region, and Oman's weak, structurally weak economy right now puts the ceiling on what China can do there. In 2017, all we heard was, nothing but, China was announcing $11 billion worth of projects into Duqm. They had loaned Oman something like $3.5 billion to help sort out their federal budget for the year. It really looked like the bilateral relationship was going to take off. But as you mentioned, this creates some very serious dependency issues. I think the Omani government was not comfortable with that. And at the same time, I think Chinese commercial actors weren't very comfortable with the fact that they didn't see a profit anytime in the near future. So Oman became a lot less valuable to China, despite its tremendous geographical endowments. So, there's a lot of balls in the air you have to think about, not just about the, how this might fit in strategically, but what are the commercial logic and how does it engage with the rest of the region? So it's a lot of pieces in the puzzle to really look at this from a kind of a holistic angle.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yuting, would you like to jump in on any points? You've covered a great deal of this in your past comments, but are there any points you'd like to throw on the table?
Yes, just a couple points. I think, to kind of, reemphasize the importance of the UAE in the region because of its hyperconnectivity. I think, yes, on the state level, in terms of China's strategy, China is going to expand its bilateral relations with all the GCC states. But on the ground level, obviously, UAE is going to be the epicenter and going to be the important node for Chinese migration into the region. And we've already seen that the UAE become the base of a broader, Chinese business and entrepreneurial community in the region, and actually even beyond the region. It can stretch actually well into the Horn of Africa. So we're actually looking at GCC and especially UAE as a sort of connecting points of all these flows of people and capital. Just last week, I wanted to mention this sort of as an anecdotal note. Last week on March the 2nd, Lang actually started his global tour for 2 years. This is the first one. And then coming to UAE for his first stop on his global tour, I think it's actually quite telling. And obviously, there's a people actually working on both sides to make this happen. And this is also the only classic piano concert actually in the Abu Dhabi festival this year. So that actually tells us something about the future of this type of collaboration between China and the UAE is really becoming more diversified, and there's a lot more emphasis on cultural exchanges. And of course, the media itself is Western classic music, but then that doesn't matter. It really shows that, that both sides actually are moving toward each other in many different ways. And I think that hyperconnectivity is going to make the UAE very central in China's future, presence here. In the region. Another point I wanted to make, I think it probably again has to do with a very important element of promoting China's image and also long-term interest, that is language. Again, UAE has been quite committed in promoting Chinese language education in the country. And we've seen the growth of Chinese language program in the public schools around the UAE. And this started in 2018 after President Xi's visit to the region, and it continued. And then later on, of course, we also see the increasing number of private operations in the region. So with all of that, I think, there will be greater interest probably in the population and to start actually looking into media content. And with that kind of language skills, ability, and also a greater appreciation for Chinese culture, especially if you look at the influence of South Korea in the region, I think a lot of those actually happen through the South Korean cultural industry, especially through the influence of K-pop, K-drama, and that hasn't really happened here yet. But yes, the younger generation, my students' generation, late teen, early, in the early 20s, and then start looking at different sort of media contents. They're very interested in diversity, actually. So they have developed this kind of global taste. I think that would be very useful, actually, for the Chinese policymaker to think about how to engage with the young audience. So that
Great.
might be my prediction, sort of something that should happen probably in the future, and with this kind of on the grassroots level, and then social media producers, and then again some other state agencies, and then they might actually find interesting areas to expand.
Great. There's a lot to watch there. Let me right now, I think we have a number of questions that we should start ticking off and attending to from our audience here. So I'm going to put forth a couple of them. The first one is going to be from Mohammed, because this relates to something you mentioned about China playing the role, or being perceived as wanting to play the role of a security partner, security guarantor in the region, perhaps in the shadow of American interest. But the question essentially says, to what extent are Chinese strategies related to long-term economic interests, as opposed to indications or a willingness to shoulder some of the responsibilities, presumably security responsibilities that would help with stability. I think whether it's Afghanistan or the more recent invasion of Ukraine, we have seen China playing a role that some might describe as a quasi-mediator, or being inclined to play that quasi-mediation role. But what is your extent? You've talked about the historical background. What is your perception on how China views stability in the Middle East, and what and what their objectives there are? That's the question to you. Before I'll throw out the other one to Jonathan so he can think about it. There was another question about the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Iran's status, or a process of coming into being and as a member, and what that means, for what implications that has for China Gulf ties. So let me kick things off with those two questions. Maybe Mohammed, you could take the first one.
Thank you. I think the debate on a nation's involvement overseas and its security commitments, these are evolving and changing debates. They respond to external developments, but also sort of the internal zeitgeist in any given country. And there's also, of course, differences among different constituencies, and even disciplinary breakdowns about their attitudes on external involvement. There's a great book by Daniel Lynch on providing a landscape view of the debates among Chinese elites about multiple issues. And he shows that typically people who are IR oriented in the political sciences tend to over-exaggerate the extent of China's capacity and power, while demographers, people who study social science issues related to China internally, are far more sensitive to the limitations of China's ability to really play that type of externally oriented interventionist role, right? In terms of that China has demographic problems, it has very serious economic and environmental problems, where much of the state's resources should be directed towards. Having said that, there have been changes in the last decade, especially under the administration of Xi Jinping, where there is a slow developing framework, as well as a set of tools being developed that enable different types of interventions. For example, the enactment of changes in the law that allow for the deployment of a limited amount of military units abroad for overseas missions, cooperation in sort of crime-related operations in Southeast Asia, and the like. So there might very well be a shift towards greater external involvement. And of course, Djibouti is often mentioned as a reference point. But my reading of the discussion and the debate in China about the Middle East is that the Middle East often tends to be characterized as, to put it very bluntly, a sort of a graveyard of empires. And that involvement, whether in terms of security or military commitments, will be very dangerous for the country's long-term interests. So I don't really see a shift taking place with regards to that. I mean, the emphasis has always been at the official and academic level that stability can be obtained in the region through economic development. And that's really where China can play a positive role in that context. But in terms of actually deploying security and military assets, that's largely absent from the debate in China. Having said that, the view from the Beltway, as well as from sort of regional capitals, might be different. And that has a lot to do, I think, with gaps in knowledge, and also people oftentimes projecting their own specters and fears onto the other. So, for example, in the case of, say, the Arab region, for the last 20 years, you've had this narrative of a rising China with considerable economic wherewithal and expanding economic footprint. And that has generated all types of narratives, especially under the shadow of the Belt and Road Initiative, of expectations of Chinese involvement. So, off the top of my head, Kuwait is a very good example. I wrote a piece for your institute looking at the debate in Kuwait about the Silk City and how this was entangled with perceptions that China is going to develop a naval base in one of the Kuwaiti islands and place Kuwait under protection. The same debate was replicated in the case of Iran with the Comprehensive Strategic Agreement. And we see it in the case of Syria, where China's economic footprint is nearly nil. So there is a lot of fantasy making about sort of China and its expected role in the region that doesn't necessarily live up to the realities of its actual hard power capacities and the attitudes one sees, at least from Chinese academics who are mirroring the debates taking place among policymakers. I would not claim to know what policymakers are thinking, but we can get a sense of some of those aspects, at least from the wider debate taking place around them. Right? Yan Xuetong has the argument of mirroring policymaking as a way to gauge sort of the changing attitudes and thinking in China. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. Jonathan, over to you on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Sure. But before I do, I just want to reemphasize a great point Mohammed made, is that when you hear Chinese officials talk about security in the Middle East, it's always security is the result of development. Chinese leaders never talk about a militarized approach. There's a great book that Mohammed and I both know the author, Andrea Giseli, just published this book on how China's had a more securitized foreign policy, but that's not a matter of power projection. That's mostly about securing its interests in the region or securing assets and citizens. So you don't see any kind of Chinese militarized approach to the region, and they keep saying the same thing over and over again. We don't see the region that way. When they talk about what Middle East security looks like, they keep saying that security is the result of development. We're more than happy to work with you on development issues, but don't expect China to play the same kind of role as the US. And I think, again, the point Mohammed make is about how we often project our own ideas. This is something we often see from the West, is when is China going to start doing what other external powers have done in the past? And I think you're wasting your time, because it's just not the way the PRC seems to be wired about this. For one thing, the Middle East isn't really what you would call a core interest. So why would they send those finite military, resources to this region when they have more than enough, concerns with those 14 countries that share a border with it. So I really think that we're barking up the wrong tree if that's what we're looking for. Now, in terms of the SCO, I'm so glad you gave me this question because I wanted it when I saw it in the question bar. Because I've been looking at the SCO for a long time, and I published something in the Monkey Cage, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years ago, saying like, Pakistan and India joined. What does this mean for the rest of the Middle East? Because Iran, of course, has been trying since, I believe, 2008. They've been an observer member for at least that long. They've wanted the status of full membership for a very long time. And the SCO, which is Russia, China, and now India and Pakistan, and 4 of the 5 Central Asian republics, they used this clause in the SCO charter that said, well, if a country is under UN sanctions, they can't join as a full member. And it almost seemed like the Iran clause. Like, Russia kept saying we're interested, and China kept saying, well, we're not so interested. And the smaller Central Asian countries obviously didn't want this kind of, their influence to be diluted by bringing Iran in. So I think the bigger issue, again, I alluded to earlier, Beijing was looking at Iran with an eye to Washington and saying, look, if we let Iran into this group, which is already being hyped in the West as this kind of anti-Western, Asian NATO type security organization, bringing Iran in is really going to put some pressure on that China-US relationship. So they could always use that flimsy UN sanctions. And, after the JCPOA, it looked like Iran was going to be, become more of a, like a normal country, and it might have a path into the SCO. I remember talking to some Chinese friends in Beijing and Shanghai, and they were saying, we've been hearing rumblings that other countries in the Gulf would want a similar type of consideration. If Iran's in, we want in too. And I think that holds because during the summit last September, I guess, August, September, I can't remember when it was announced by Xi Jinping that Iran's membership was being processed, that it was on a path, not that it was a member, but that it was on path to membership, that Saudi, Qatar, and Egypt were also given this observer membership status. So again, I think there's this measured approach to saying, look, if we're not going to tip the scales in one country's favor, we're going to try to make sure that it works in a way that doesn't alienate any important regional partners. One important point I'd make about this is a lot of the benefits that Iran stands to gain from these institutional recognitions like the SCO or from the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, they don't work if Iran remains on the outside of most international norms. If it's under sanctions, if there's no financial institutions in Iran that are able to absorb foreign capital or foreign investment or do foreign transactions. So yeah, you can say we're going to let you be a member of the SCO, but if Iran is still under sanctions, then what good is it, right? Because they still can't get any kind of financial benefits out of it. And it's the same thing with the partnership. I think what China was doing in Iran was, one, building its leverage as a bargaining chip with Washington, and two, saying, look, these things we're offering you, this partnership, this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, these things open the door to you getting foreign capital, to getting investment, to getting the things you need to get back on track. But if you're going to continue to be such a disruptive international and regional actor, you don't get any of this stuff because we're not going to be sanctioned. Our companies aren't going to be sanctioned in the US for the benefit of working more closely with Iran. So there are strings attached. I think there's, the carrot and the stick, right? Yeah, we'll offer you these great memberships or these great partnerships. But if you're going to think that we're doing this at the sacrifice of our own much more important strategic relationships, you're crazy. We're not going to do that. So I would look at the SCO as yeah, it has the potential to be useful for Iran, but I wouldn't get too excited about it until all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed and we see something come of it. And even when that's the case, I'd expect to see some other Gulf countries elevate their position within the same organization.
Thanks, Jonathan. There are two or three questions. I think one is best suited for Yuting. Then there are two trade-related questions that I might take a quick stab at and give Yuting a few minutes to prepare her remarks. So the first one over to you is, let's see here. Yeah, I mean, there was a question really about China's Chinese Muslims, and there is a good and albeit growing body of research that looks at the many different Chinese Muslim minorities living in China, and these works have described these populations as both, in many cases, an asset, and in other cases, liabilities to ties with the Middle East and North Africa. So I'd be curious to get your view. I know this is an area that you've looked into, and your view on that relationship and how those particular people-to-people ties impact relations. The other two questions, so I'll come back to you in just a moment. I'll briefly tick off two other questions that are trade related. One asked if GCC China trade is likely to deepen or perhaps increase in the future. And then another question talking about how does the UAE, or the perception of competition, rising competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, impact this trade relation, the GCC's trading relations with China, and impact these economic relationships. I guess I would briefly say here that, I think the short answer to the first question is economic ties, specifically in trade investment, are increasing. They are growing, but there's a caveat. They're not growing indefinitely, and they're not growing at the same pace in all directions. And I think a number of the different panelists have referred to this kind of more nuanced view about the growth of China's presence. This, in particular, I'm speaking about the economic influence. I wrote an article, my last article on AGSIW's website, describes this in more detail. So I won't take up too much time, but I would say rather than just thinking about whether China's economic ties with the GCC are growing, I think it's more interesting to ask, where are they growing and how are they growing? What are those sectors? Because if you break down the trading relationship, countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, others, I mean, the majority of trade flows, at least exports from the region going to China, are constituting hydrocarbon commodities. So you have to ask, what are some of the other areas that we could see growth in Gulf exports to China? And then moving in the other direction, where can Chinese exports to the Gulf, where can those grow? And I think those are the more useful questions when we start thinking about where that relationship will look in the future. As for the UAE Saudi angle, yes, I think it's accurate to say that there is this growing sense of healthy economic competition. I would describe it as such. The three areas I would watch in terms of areas that are likely to impact China-Gulf ties have to do with free trade zones, re-exports, which are related to free trade zones, and tourism. I think those are the key areas. I mean, right now, a lot of Chinese exports move through the UAE, and my understanding is that Saudi officials really want to attract and reroute some of those exports, reconfigure some of the trading routes to essentially move around the UAE and directly to the larger market in Saudi Arabia. I think part and parcel of that strategy is creating more special economic zones and free zones, of which the UAE is well known for, but the Saudi Ministry of Investment wants to create a number of their own zones. And then finally, we all know that Saudi Arabia is making a big push on the tourism front. And I believe, maybe not over the next couple of years because of this zero COVID policy, but in the medium and longer terms, we'll definitely be looking toward Chinese tourists to help with that development push. So I'll leave it there. Back to my original question for Yuting, and I'll let you take the floor.
Okay, so this is a question that I always have to deal with, and because the social cultural context here in the UAE, it's inevitable that people will ask about the experiences of Chinese Muslims. I think this is, of course, a very complex issue. It has a very long history, and so I think I would also actually emphasize what Mohammed has said earlier about this historical connection, between China and the Middle East throughout during the imperial period, and then of course, throughout the 20th century. And so we're looking at this dynamic relationships. And so the Muslims have been, especially the Sinophone Muslims, the Chinese-speaking Muslims, we also have experts in the audience. And so they know very well that the Sinophone Muslims especially could become actually a very important asset for China. And it had been. In recent years, and we hear less talk about the Muslims because of COVID. But I've written actually about their experiences, and actually I see them as an important mediator, actually, or the bridge maker between China and the UAE. I still hold that kind of positive outlook on this. Based on my research in the region, I can see that despite this very complex relationship between China, the Chinese majority and the minorities, and then because of the state's strategy, and it's a difficult situation, but we've seen a lot of these efforts on the grassroots level, and really trying to sort of build the bridge between the non-Muslim Chinese and then the Muslim minorities through the everyday, sort of day-to-day work of Chinese-speaking Muslims. But of course, the Uyghur issue is more difficult to talk about. And then I have very limited research experience with Uyghurs here in the UAE. As a Chinese person or Chinese researcher, I'm not really trusted. So it has been actually difficult to talk to them and to understand their predicaments. But I think to answer Marian's question, and also what Robert asked earlier, yes, it could be actually a liability for China. At the state level, I don't really see much, really. There's very little discussion about China's policy toward Muslims. And of course, among people and the population, yes, there are a lot of concerns how China's policy toward Muslims would actually affect its relationship with Muslim society in general. But I think, the audience here in the region have really prioritized the need of economic growth than some of these more complicated and issues that has to do with religion, with culture, with that kind of historical connections and so on. So I think it's really about prioritization. So right now, the GCC cares a lot more about the economic ties with China. And then from there, they expand to cultural and social exchanges. And I think in that aspect, and then the Muslims can play a very important role if this is done right. So in that sense, it could become an important middleman, between the both sides. So that would be my very, very superficial sort of assessment of the Muslim problem of China, so to speak.
Well, I appreciate you tackling a sensitive issue, and thank you for that. We're coming to the end with just a couple minutes left. I don't think we have time to embark on any more questions, but I did want to give either Mohammed or Jonathan a chance to add anything that came up in these last few question and answer, back and forth. So I guess I'll give the floor to either of you if there's anything else you'd like to add. Mohammed, Jonathan, any last points?
Jonathan, would you like to go, or
Very
maybe
briefly,
we share the minute?
I'll take just a couple of seconds of it. For a shameless plug, I just rolled out a new podcast last month, the China Mina podcast. And as Yuting mentioned, we had a conversation recently. She is the excellent second guest of the podcast. We'll be releasing our next episode next week. So Yuting goes really deeply into a lot of the social issues of China and the UAE, and it's fascinating. So, keep an eye out for that and subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. Mohammed.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe just emphasize key points that sort of tie everything together, which is that the story of China-Middle East relations requires us to have a mindset that historicizes these relations and sees them as parts of ebbs and flows, that recognizes that the story is really a local story. So there is a lot of local agency, and a lot of the flagship projects tend to be concocted by local bureaucrats, developers, and actors, as opposed to in Beijing. which is a misconception. And of course, the third aspect of this story is that it needs to be read multilaterally, in the sense that China is not the only actor in the region. The Gulf is interacting with many different external players. And the Gulf, at the end of the day, tied to the local aspect, is pursuing its own national interest, right? And that means engaging with China in their particular arenas. I think these are points that are very basic, but need to be emphasized, I think, when thinking about the relationship. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. In no way am I going to try to wrap things up better than that. I think that's a good way to bring this event to a close. I'll thank all of the panelists once again and everyone who joined us from the audience. Definitely stay tuned to more programs and publications for this new initiative, the Gulf China Initiative at AGSIW. And yeah, we hope to see everyone again soon. So thank you very much and take care.